world is blue at its edges and in its depths. For many years, I have been moved by the blue at the far edge of what can be seen, that colour of horizons, of remote mountain ranges, of anything far away. The colour of that distance is the colour of an emotion, the colour of solitude and of desire, the colour of there seen from here, the colour of where you are not, and the colour of where you can never go. It's a quote by Rebecca Solnit from A Field Guide to Getting Lost. So, welcome to Stories in Colour, a podcast from the National Gallery in London, mapping how colour has transformed the world. We take you through the secret histories of colours from antiquity to contemporary pop culture, and on the way we stop off to look at art from our collection and beyond. Today, blue is the world's favourite colour, but it took humans a really long time to create beautiful blue pigments. When you look around you in the world, yes, there's blue in the sky and in the sea, but those blues are illusions, and natural blue pigments themselves are very rare. You might have heard of ultramarine, made from the semi-precious mineral lapis lazuli, used heavily during the Renaissance, but blue pigments are almost entirely a human invention. So today, we're skipping forward to perhaps the world's very first modern synthetic pigment. From its very unlikely discovery to its starring role in Japanese printmaking and Picasso's blue period, we're telling the enigmatic story of Prussian blue. I'm your host, Beks Leary from the Digital Department at the National Gallery, and with me today is Evie Hatch. Evie's an art historian specialising in the history and characteristics of artist pigments. She is the writer and presenter of Jackson's Art Pigment Stories series. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I love that quote that you said at the beginning. That was amazing. Beautiful quote.
I think it captures something of how enigmatic the pigment we're talking about today is. So could you tell us a little bit about Prussian blue and why we're talking about it today?
Yeah. Prussian blue is a very, very deep, very, very inky synthetic blue pigment that was discovered at the very beginning of the 18th century, and it was discovered completely by accident, which is one of the reasons why it's a very enigmatic, very mysterious material. Pigments, just to explain, so pigments are chemical compounds. They're what's added to a binding medium, whether that is oil for oil paint or gum arabic for watercolour. And if you're walking through the rooms of a gallery or the National Gallery, say, all of those colours you see are the results of pigment. And pigments have incredible histories. They all have kind of different personalities, different characteristics. Prussian blue is mysterious and enigmatic, which is what we'll be discussing today.
And it was one of the first 38 original crayon colours produced by Crayola.
It was.
In the early 1900s.
It was, yeah. I think in 1903, I think that was.
Yeah. And
its name was changed in the 1950s.
By Crayola?
By Crayola,
okay.
Yeah. I think the reason being could have been because by that point Prussia as a state had been dissolved, so it was thought to kind of not be relevant anymore. It was changed to midnight blue.
Okay, nice. We'll get on to Prussia in a bit.
We will.
So why was a new blue pigment so important for artists? Setting the stage at, the start of the 18th century.
The history of blue pigments is a huge subject. As you kind of touched on at the beginning, blue is one of those colours that is quite difficult to find in nature. It's simultaneously everywhere and also nowhere. So obviously the sky is blue, the sea can be blue. There are a few blue animals and insects, but those blues tend to be kind of illusions. They're not chemical blues. So blue pigments that artists have used have been quite relatively few and far between. So in Europe, we're talking, obviously this is at the beginning of the 18th century, probably the main blue is one that you mentioned, which is natural ultramarine blue. And that is extracted from a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli, and that was mined in Afghanistan. And because of its remote origins and because of the very labour-intensive process for extracting this blue pigment, it was extremely expensive, and it was reserved only for the most important subjects. So that's natural ultramarine blue. Another blue pigment, which I love.
We could have talked about so many different ones today.
So many, is smalt. Smalt was a cobalt-containing ground glass, essentially. Smalt was used from the 16th century onwards. It had one drawback. So when we're talking about these pigments, they all have drawbacks.
Right.
So ultramarine blue, very expensive.
Yeah.
Smalt, its main drawback is the fact that it turns brown in an oil binder, which actually in the National Gallery has got some really good examples of that. Okay. There's the series by Veronese. These scenes look like they're taking place under an overcast sky, but actually that sky would have once been blue. So smalt, problematic because of its permanence. There's also azurite, which is a mineral pigment, less expensive than natural ultramarine blue, but it's kind of gritty, not a great colour payoff, and it also has a tendency to turn green over time. So again, big drawback there. Another blue pigment is indigo, and that is a very, very dark blue pigment, quite similar in tone actually and hue to Prussian blue, but it's produced from a plant and exported from India mainly. But the drawback of that is that it's not very light fast. It tends to fade. Okay. So when we kind of approach the invention or the accidental discovery of Prussian blue, all of these blues that are already existing on the artist's palette have all sorts of drawbacks and limitations, and artists are very much working within these limitations.
And so what makes Prussian blue so special? And maybe tell us something about its mixing ability.
Yes. So Prussian blue is, it changed the game actually. It has a incredibly high tinting strength. When we talk about tinting strength, we're kind of talking about the capacity that it has to influence mixtures. It's incredibly strong. A tiny, tiny amount goes a long way. And that's something that artists generally love in a pigment because you don't need very much of it. It makes it quite cost effective. Okay.
Good for cash-strapped artists.
Yeah, exactly. So and artists who are listening will know this, so when you use it straight out of the tube, it's almost black. Okay. And then it dilutes out or can be tinted with white to make these lovely, a range of greeny blues up until the most kind of pale whispers of greeny blue. Beautiful. So it has that tonal range. Yeah. And that's kind of the key thing really. And also the fact that it was produced relatively cheaply as well. And
it was quite a star of the Rococo period, wasn't it, when it was mixed with white? Shall we look at a painting as an example of that?
Yes.
A Girl with a Kitten is an example from our collection.
So it's a beautiful portrait of a young girl in a magnificent blue dress and a blue bow around her neck holding a kitten. She has a far away, quite serious look at
She's
the viewer.
Looking straight at us, isn't she?
She is, yeah, she is. She seems kind of more like wiser than her years, doesn't she? It's an extraordinary painting, and she's got kind of very rosy cheeks as well.
And we should say it's a pastel painting.
It is a pastel
painting made from pastels.
Yes. So the Rococo period was a kind of ornamental style, and it spanned architecture, painting, interior decoration. It was about these kind of elaborate, kind of curved forms. And the French court in the 18th century was kind of the centre of Rococo. The word that I like to use to describe Rococo is kind of fluffy.
Yeah.
Like everything's soft and flowing.
It does seem quite traditionally feminine, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Elaborate. Really kind of like beautiful. I think lots of people would say that it's quite over the top, which it absolutely is. That kind of fluffiness and that extravagance is very much here in this painting by Perronneau.
And how does Prussian blue play its role in this painting?
This painting is kind of bathed in Prussian blue. It's in the background is Prussian blue with white. And I imagine that this would have been a pastel that would have been Prussian blue mixed with lead white, which would have been the main white then. That kind of fluffiness actually is really enhanced by the fact that it's a pastel painting.
Yeah.
It's nice to look at a pastel painting actually, because we don't often consider them really alongside oil paintings, do we?
I mean, we have so many oil paintings in our collection by comparison. So yeah, it's a beautiful painting. Okay, I think we've teased people enough with this accidental discovery of Prussian blue. Let's get into the story of how this pigment was discovered.
Oh, it's an amazing story. It's an incredible story. So to set the scene, we're in Berlin at the very beginning of the 18th century. Berlin is at a very interesting point in its history. It's in a time of regeneration. The 30 Years' War ran from 1618 to 1648. It was essentially a religious war that encompassed much of mainland Europe. And Berlin had been absolutely brought to its knees during this conflict. It was occupied by successive armies. There are two men at the very centre of this story. Both of them are called Johann, and actually everyone in this story is called Johann, almost. It gets quite confusing. The first one is Johann Jakob Diesbach, and he is a pigment and dye maker. He arrived in Berlin at the kind of the turn of the 18th century. I think 1701 is the proposed date, but not a lot is known about his life. I have a theory that the reason that he moved to Berlin was because as a pigment and dye maker, he was attracted by the emerging textile industry, which would have really relied on dyes. That's a possibility. Yeah. And he didn't have a laboratory of his own and was working in a laboratory that was owned or rented by a man called Johann Conrad Dippel. And
our second Johann.
Yes, our second Johann. And he's the star of the show, really.
Okay.
So he was an alchemist, he was a radical theologian, he was a physician, although I think by all accounts he wasn't a very good physician. He was born at Castle Frankenstein. And he did also, his main kind of thing was creating something that he called animal oil.
Animal oil,
which sounds really unpleasant. So it was a kind of a very smelly elixir made of the distilled animal blood, bones, hide, hooves.
Delicious.
Yeah, delicious. And it was used as a kind of, I'm pretty sure Dippel called it an elixir of life and tried to sell it as such. But he also kind of peddled it as a cure for everything from gout to epilepsy.
He does really sound like your stereotypical alchemist.
He is very much, yeah. Our kind of idea of what an alchemist is, it kind of comes from characters like him.
A kind of rogue inventor.
Yes, yeah, very much a rogue inventor. In his laboratory in Berlin, he was working on making his animal oil. The events of this story take place between 1704 and 1706.
So we're not quite sure when.
Yeah, not quite sure when.
It didn't happen over many years. It happened.
It was one day.
One day in that time.
Yeah, we're not 100% sure when.
Okay.
Diesbach was in Dippel's laboratory, and he was making a pigment called cochineal. And cochineal is a lake pigment, which means that it's produced from a dye, and a dye produced from extracted from crushed insects. And in order to make this cochineal pigment, he required potash, which is an alkaline substance containing potassium. And he didn't have any of his own, and he reached for this potash that belonged to Dippel. And what he didn't know is that Dippel had used this in the creation of his animal oil. So this was adulterated with animal blood, essentially.
Okay.
And so to his great surprise, when he created this what he expected to be a red pigment, it produced a blue.
And I actually imagine this scene. You're doing essentially early chemistry and you're expecting this pot to turn bright red, and you look down and I think it went kind of purpley to start with, and then it went really rich blue.
Yeah.
At the start of the 18th century, I think that must have been an absolutely astonishing moment.
Yeah, he must have been astounded by it.
Yeah.
And he, it depends on, because there are a few accounts of this story actually, but it seems like he kept it a secret from Dippel for a little while until the adulterated potash had run out, and then he was unable to do it again. So he had to kind of then confide in Dippel, who then realised that it must have been something to do with the dried animal blood. So the two men kind of worked on refining the process. and eventually coming up with a product, essentially, because it is, pigments are products.
You mentioned Castle Frankenstein earlier?
Yeah.
Is there a connection?
There is. I was hoping you'd pick up on that. Dipple was born in Castle Frankenstein. And there is a theory that Dipple was the inspiration behind Mary Shelley's Doctor Frankenstein. He does kind of fit that kind of, as you were saying, like our classic idea of what an alchemist is, and he seemed to court trouble wherever he went. Before he went to Berlin, he was accused of a murder and had to be smuggled out of a city in a cart. He wrote all these kind of inflammatory pamphlets, religious pamphlets. He seemed to have been quite interested in the reanimation of corpses or the transference of the soul from one body to another. As I said before, the elixir of life. He was interested in how he might prolong his own life. So he really does kind of fit the bill as someone who...
I feel like I'm quite convinced on this theory.
Yeah, I think I can't work out if I am or if I just really want to.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Yeah.
So maybe the inspiration for Frankenstein was the cornerstone of the creation of the world's first, well, definitely Europe's first modern synthetic pigment.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. And actually, all of Dippel's kind of activities is the reason why he didn't benefit that much, actually, from the creation of Prussian blue. He had to leave Berlin quite soon afterwards because he'd published a anti-Lutheran pamphlet which had annoyed some people in the Prussian court. He had to get out of the city quite quickly, I think.
We're going to take a quick break.
Mm-hmm.
After the break, we're going to come back and kind of explain the scientific process actually for how Prussian blue is made, which they didn't really know or understand at the time. But of course we do today. So we'll see you shortly after the break. Yeah, we said we're going to talk a little bit about the scientific composition of Prussian blue and why did that animal oil turn something they expected to be red blue?
Prussian blue is essentially a complex of iron salts. It's created by the oxidization of iron salts, and at the end of the reaction you get ferric ferrocyanide. So essentially that's what Prussian blue is. It contains iron and it contains cyanide, and that's really where the dried cattle blood came in, because that's what it's contributing. It's contributing that iron. It's interesting because it wasn't really for many, many years, the exact kind of chemistry behind Prussian blue wasn't really known, and it remained very, very mysterious, and people thought that the process was very kind of peculiar, very mysterious, which does feed into that kind of idea of it being an enigmatic pigment as well.
It does seem so unlikely that it was even discovered.
Yes, so it's the kind of thing you wouldn't think of, isn't it? Like you wouldn't. It's not when people were endeavouring to make a pigment. Say, you might think to yourself, this, and if I do this and this and this happens. But Prussian blue, it would have been quite bewildering, I think.
Yeah, and you mentioned cyanide. Does that mean that this is one of those toxic pigments that we have to be really careful with today?
No, actually, no. So Prussian blue is not a toxic pigment. And the reason for that is because the cyanide is bound with the iron, and actually it has been used to colour food.
Really?
Yeah. So it's not a toxic pigment in itself.
You'd hope not.
Yeah, you would
used as a food dye.
Although I think a lot of toxic pigments have been eaten in the but this is not one of them.
Okay, that's good. Prussian blue itself, not toxic. Cyanide, obviously toxic. Does it have any relationship with?
It does, yeah. So it can be used to make hydrogen cyanide, which is a poisonous gas. So there's that, but then Prussian blue is also a antidote for various types of heavy metal poisoning. So it's by thallium or cesium. And
is that used today?
Yeah, that's used. This partly how it's used today. So it's fascinating, and I think that's one really interesting thing about pigments is that yes, they produce colour, but then often they kind of feed into so many other areas as well.
Right. Yeah, because you kind of expect that it would feed into industries like house paint and that kind of thing, but that feels very adjacent. But then to leap to a medical use, like healing someone from poisoning.
Yeah.
It feels a bit wild.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, and there are a lot of pigments like that. Yeah,
it's really cool. Okay, the other thing we teased earlier was about Prussia, and that it doesn't exist as a state today. So how did it get the Prussian blue name? What does that mean?
So Prussia's quite difficult to define, actually. Prussia's been lots of different things. So it started off as a feudal state, and then it was a kingdom, and then I believe it was a state again before it was dissolved in 1945. When Prussian blue was invented, Prussia had just become a kingdom. It was kind of elevated to a kingdom in 1701.
Okay, and whereabouts in the world is it?
It was formed of quite disparate territories. So quite a bit of North Germany, and then also a fair amount of Poland and Lithuania.
So the discovery was made in Berlin.
So okay. Berlin was the capital of Prussia, and it had just become so. It was called Prussian blue or Berlin blue pretty much from the beginning.
And how does it become such a popular pigment?
It spread incredibly quickly, which is something that really, really fascinates me, actually. So it was, as I said, it was discovered between 1704 and 1706. And in 1710, there was, actually, we need to bring in another Johann, actually. So
Johann number 3, I'm keeping count.
Johann number 3. So after Johann Conrad Dippel fled Berlin, Diesbach, our original Johann, he went into business with our third Johann, who is Johann Leonard Frisch. And he's actually best known as being a linguist and an ornithologist. Okay.
What's that for those who don't know?
Someone who studies birds.
Okay.
But he also took an interest in this new opportunity, essentially. And he wrote an advert, actually, we'll call it, in a journal called the Miscellanea Berlinensia. Berlinensia, so Berlina is the kind of female personification of Berlin.
Oh, okay.
So
right.
yeah, so it's a kind of,
what does any of that mean?
It's a kind of Latinate kind of.
Yeah,
it's very, very, very grand. And Leonard Frisch managed to get this text that he'd written, and he published it anonymously in this journal. And he managed to get it in at the very last minute. It was just about to go to print. It reads like an influencer, like
modern marketing.
Yeah, it does. It reads like a bit of social media text. It's really interesting, kind of extolling the virtues of this pigment and how much better it is than anything else, any other blue pigment before.
He's really selling it.
And he also says about how you can eat it.
Really?
Yeah, because it was a major concern, for the toxicity of pigments was well known.
Yeah.
And I think we often assume that people didn't care about how toxic pigments were back then, but this kind of shows that they absolutely did. So this kind of, this advert basically that he wrote, he had a kind of real financial stake in it, and I think he became quite wealthy. That's part of the reason why it spread so quickly. But I think people were just, art and artists particularly, were so kind of taken with it and what it could do and how different it was to blue pigments that had been before. So it spread very, very quickly. And we know, for example, that it reached the French court by 1710 because it appears in a painting dated to that time by Antoine Watteau, who was a French court painter.
So yeah, it's being manufactured, it's being marketed. Do other people also start to make the pigment, or is there like one distributor?
They do eventually. The Johanns keep it very close to their chest for a long time. The Johanns. Diesbach and Frisch keep the recipe a very closely guarded secret, as you can imagine. I think we all kind of would if we had that kind of knowledge. It was eventually kind of published. It was eventually worked out how to make it. And it was published by an Englishman called John Woodward. And after that point, the production of the pigment kind of exploded. And it was produced all across Europe and also in America as well.
So we have this pigment that is being marketed, it's spreading. Is that confined to Europe? Does it go beyond that?
It goes beyond Europe. It becomes incredibly successful in Japan. In Japan, Prussian blue, kind of in the early years of the 18th century, Prussian blue was being imported in very sporadic amounts by the Dutch into Nagasaki, and it was still at this point a very expensive pigment. It was used mainly by Japanese painters. And then later on, the pigment became much less expensive. And this is when it began to take off in Japanese woodblock printmaking. But later on, it became much cheaper to produce in Europe and therefore became much more accessible to people in Japan. And it began to be taken up by Japanese woodcut printmakers. And it lent itself really, really beautifully to the technique of woodcut printmaking, because you have that incredible tonal range. You get the very, very dark darks and the very, very pale, going back to the Rebecca Solnit quote actually about this whole idea of like distance. It does distance really, really well, because that kind of pale, hazy blue that you get, really, really beautiful.
And those printmakers were particularly looking at landscape.
Yes, a lot of them were looking at landscape.
So that's really helpful for depicting the distance through that tonal range.
Yeah. And there was, and this is now referred to as the Blue Revolution in Japanese printmaking.
So what were they using before that? What were they using before the Prussian blue was imported?
Either indigo or a blue pigment made from dayflower.
Okay.
Both of which are, you need a lot of it to get a really, really strong colour. And also they are fugitive, which means that they are prone to fading.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there an example of, maybe a famous use of this?
There is a
Japanese
very famous example.
printmakers, yeah.
Hokusai's The Great Wave of Kanagawa. That is printed with Prussian blue. So that is part of a series, actually, 36 views of Mount Fuji. Prints that were made entirely using blue, perhaps entirely using Prussian blue, were known as Aitsuri-e, The Great Wave of Kanagawa, is one of them. And it's one of the most, iconic images ever.
It's definitely what I think of when I think of Japanese artworks.
Yeah.
It's staggering, isn't it? I mean, the wave towers over this sea scene. There are small boats. The waves are frothing very energetically in lots of whites. There's quite a pale sky, lots of froth coming off of the waves.
Yes, very frothy. Yeah.
But that blue really does stand out a lot, doesn't it? It was made in 1830 to 32. Yeah, so we're at the start of the 19th century here.
Prints like these were incredibly influential on the Impressionist movement back in Europe. And it's a really interesting, that kind of movement of Prussian blue from Europe to Japan, and then Japanese prints making their way from the mid-19th century back to Europe, prints often containing Prussian blue, is one of the most kind of interesting aspects of Prussian blue story, actually. The way that the pigment was a kind of vessel for cultural exchange.
Let's leave it there so we can take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll look at the Impressionists. So before the break, we had travelled from Berlin all the way over to Japan, and now we're making our way back again to Europe and the age of the Impressionists. So could you tell us about the story of Prussian blue, the influence of Japanese printmaking on the Impressionists? How does that all tie together?
Well, to begin with, the Impressionist movement was a movement in the kind of latter half of the 19th century, mainly focused around French painters and characterized by a kind of break from the tradition of painting, a break from the salon, break from religious subjects or historical subjects. It was very much focused on the landscape, the day-to-day. At this time, we have an enormous number of Japanese objects, including Japanese prints, kind of flooding onto the European market. There is a world fair in Paris that had a kind of exhibition of Japanese goods, and it really became
like a fashion or a trend almost.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And these images, these prints were hugely influential on the Impressionists. So within Japanese printmaking, there's a tradition called, or not just printmaking, actually Japanese imagery called ukiyo-e, which literally translates to images of the floating world, which is so beautiful.
That's magical.
It is. It's so magical. And it was, to begin with, was kind of associated with this idea of melancholy and loss, but became associated with pleasure and...
people at leisure?
Yeah, people at leisure, people about their everyday life. So a lot of these prints, many of them were made using Prussian blue, were flooding Europe, and they were scenes of everyday life, everyday leisure, everyday people at leisure. And this is a huge, and it's something I think we forget about the Impressionist movement actually, is exactly how much this was influenced by Japanese images. And there's a painting by Monet called Bathers at la Grenouillère, which literally means bathers at the frog pond. And it's very much an image that is kind of the floating world, even though it's of a pond which is, I believe, a few miles outside Paris.
On the Seine River, I think.
Yes, it is on the Seine. Yeah, it is on the Seine. And it's quite an early one of Monet's, really. It's a few years before his famous sunrise painting that is kind of seen to be the kind of inciting painting of the Impressionist movement. But we see very much the hallmarks of of Impressionist painting here. Broad brushstrokes, kind of very much interested in light and how light behaves, and about kind of capturing an impression of a moment rather than focusing on detail necessarily.
There's a lot of feeling in the painting.
Yeah.
So yeah, to set the scene, there's some rowing boats at the front of the painting, a kind of dappled bluish light on the water, some people milling around, walking out onto a jetty. It's a sunny day, looks like it might be in summer. There's lots of trees overhanging the water. It looks quite idyllic, really. It looks like everyone's sort of having quite a nice time.
Yeah, it does. And that composition is very reminiscent of Japanese images, that kind of diagonal that you get running from the bottom left up
so
through
there's
the centre.
like the structure of the painting, there's kind of a through line on the diagonal.
Yeah, and also the fact that the horizon line is so close to the top of the picture. Again, these are things that we kind of expect from Impressionist paintings, but really at this point they're quite kind of unusual, kind of a step outside of what is normally expected from painting. And
I should say as well that you can see this painting at the National Gallery. So this is a painting in our collection.
It's a beautiful painting. So it has composition in common with Japanese painting, but it also contains quite a bit of Prussian blue. So there's Prussian blue in the sky. That kind of little area of sky in the top right-hand corner is Prussian blue, would be mixed with some white. Prussian blue is also used here for the very dark values. So the bodies of the bathers in their swimming costumes and in the water as well.
So yeah, we've talked about, I guess, the Japanese influence and the kind of mood of these paintings. The kind of mood of Prussian blue as well had a big impact on Picasso. So yeah, if we head a little further forward into the early 20th century, we get to Picasso's blue period, when he suffered the tragic loss of a friend. And yeah, do you want to tell us just a little bit about the use of Prussian blue there?
Picasso's blue period is an example of an artist that really makes use of the emotional weight of Prussian blue, that kind of heaviness that it has. It can, and we talked about the kind of fluffiness of the Rococo and those kind of light pastel blues. It has that kind of optimistic side to it, but then there's also the kind of heavy black but not quite black, carries a lot of emotional weight.
So we've looked at some more traditional uses of Prussian blue in painting and printmaking, but how does it get used today is my next question, because I believe it gives blueprints their name.
It does, yeah. A blueprint is another word for a product of the cyanotype process. And this is actually a photographic process. And it involves applying a solution of iron salts to a piece of paper or to textiles. It goes on, it's really interesting, it goes on as a kind of sickly kind of green colour. But then when you put it out in the sun or on a UV, expose it in a UV light box, it becomes a deep blue, Prussian blue. It literally forms Prussian blue. And that's where we get the term blueprint.
So yeah, it was used for those early, so a blueprint is like it's now, the term is now used for like a technical drawing or design. So if you imagine architects drawing a plan for a building, that would, the original plan for the building would be called a blueprint. And then it also gets used quite colloquially, I think, now as well. So like the inception of something or the beginnings of something.
Yeah.
But it began as like early photocopying, basically.
Yeah, it is basically photocopying. Yeah. It was invented by was it John Herschel? I think
who was an Englishman. He was actually the first Englishman to pursue photography. Okay. So it kind of makes sense that he was knowledgeable about photographic processes.
That does make sense. Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, in artistic work as well, Prussian blue is definitely still used. You can still get it in most paint ranges. But in general, its use has really declined since the 1970s, which is when the copper phthalocyanine, so phthalo blue pigments were introduced. And those are the pigments that are used in toothpaste.
We don't have time to get into that now, but that's fascinating.
Another episode entirely.
So yeah, I guess talking about, we've shaped the period through which Prussian blue has been popular from its inception to the 1970s. How is that useful for dating pictures? Because I guess there's like quite a specific time period that it's been used. And can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, because there is such a definitive time at which Prussian blue was introduced and invented, it's very useful for dating pictures, which is incredibly useful for authenticating them. Obviously, art forgery, forgers can make something that looks like a famous artist's work to look at it, but when you analyse it, if you find a pigment that was not invented, was not used at that time, then you can be pretty sure that things are not what they should be,
Yeah.
And there's a really good example of it, which was a painting called The Madonna of the Veil, and it was thought to be a Botticelli.
And I should say it's a Courtauld painting from the Courtauld Gallery in London.
Yeah. So it was when it was brought, it was thought to be a Botticelli. Everyone, I say everyone, people were fairly sure it was a Botticelli. There were people who doubted it simply because, on stylistic terms, simply because how much the Madonna looked like a film star, a 1920s film star.
Okay.
She looks a bit like Jean Harlow.
Okay, amazing.
Which kind of set alarm bells ringing.
Right, because there are doppelgangers in our collection sometimes. I wander around and think, oh, that kind of looks like that person, but not exactly like.
No. And when it was the painting was analysed, so the pigments were analysed in the 1990s. They found a few anomalies. One of them was that Prussian blue was present, and that's a pretty kind of clear sign that it's not real. So it was by a famous forger called Umberto Gianti,
who was kind of working in the 1900s.
Yeah.
And obviously Sandro Botticelli working in the 15th to very early 16th century.
Yes, so very different. Yeah.
Just a few hundred years apart.
Yeah. It's funny how these forgeries are kind of interesting objects in themselves. It may not be a Botticelli, but it's still an interesting painting.
And I guess the fact that it's duped people for so long shows that there is technique and prowess. And
a huge amount of skill. Yeah.
Skill there.
Huge amount of skill. But I don't think that Gianti anticipated the technology that we have now for analysing the chemical composition of pigments. There's obviously Prussian blue being the first modern synthetic pigment is very distinct chemically. And I should also say actually that it's the first modern synthetic pigment, but it's by no means the first synthetic pigment. And when we talk about synthetic pigments, we often think of modernity. We think of modern chemistry, but actually pigments have been made synthetically for thousands of years. Egyptian blue is perhaps the first synthetic pigment.
When we say synthetic as well, we just mean that it doesn't occur naturally. Someone has to chemically combine things to make a compound that makes the pigment.
Exactly, yeah. So Egyptian blue was made synthetically. That was produced over 5,000 years ago. And Naples yellow is another one. That's another very ancient one. So synthetic pigments aren't new, but I suppose the thing that was new with Prussian blue is that it's synthetic in a way that it doesn't mimic something that already exists in nature, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you wouldn't
it's
find it naturally occurring anywhere.
No. Yeah.
That is basically the story, I think, that we've told of Prussian blue. Do you have any final thoughts or feelings about this? Very enigmatic.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I find really interesting about Prussian blue, or pigments in general really, is when we think of what drives artistic movements or drives artistic practice, we often think of things like changes in society or religious ideas or political ideas, and that those are the things that drive movements. But really, these kind of technologies are also really important. You know, if we can think about the advent of printing technology in Europe and how much that changed images, or the invention of photography and the impact that had on painting. But then we can also extend that, definitely, I think, to the invention of pigments. And Prussian blue is a really good example of that, because it was invented accidentally. You know, it was introduced and artists kind of expanded into it. It may not have kind of driven an art movement necessarily, but there's so much that I think wouldn't have been possible without the invention of Prussian blue.
Fantastic. We have one final question. So at the end of the podcast, we always get a question in from our audience. This one came in on YouTube. They have asked, is Prussian blue a stable pigment?
Yes and no. It's a very irritating answer. The very early versions of Prussian blue were very variable. They were made by different processes, which could affect how light fast, so whether they faded, could affect how light fast they were or how permanent they were. In general, today it is quite stable. However, the interesting thing is, which might be interesting to artists, is that Prussian blue can't be used with an acrylic binder. And this is because it's quite sensitive to alkaline binders.
Okay, so
and
the opposite of an acid.
Yeah, the opposite of an acid, yeah. And because acrylic binders are alkaline, Prussian blue may go brown in an acrylic binder. Yeah, so if you look very carefully, at Prussian blue acrylic paints, often they contain like a mixture of different pigments and not actually Prussian blue.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. So that's the end of our episode today. If you listening have got more questions about the story of colour, the visual culture of colour, any colour, you can email us on podcast@nationalgallery.org.uk, or you can just mention the podcast if you message us on our social media channels, and we will try and answer some of your questions in our next series of stories in colour. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode on Prussian blue, with massive thank you to our guest, Evie. I've been your host, Beks Leary. Our producer was Harry Rosehill. Our researcher was Hannah Rogers. Our scientific advisor was Marika Spring. Technicians were Ian Warren, John Sheldon, Ash Baker, Stephen Pascal, Tom Gulliver and Timothy Carpenter. Our video producer was Jean Kenyon. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time. Yay!
Hey. Nice.
Well done, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.